Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Bhasme. I really appreciate you taking your time to join us today and providing us with your consent form signed and being aware of the contents of this study and the purpose of this study. We are very honored and humbled to have you on our show today. Um, do you have any questions about the project in general to begin with?
Not really, but I just wanted to understand what is the larger aim in terms of understand that is it focus South Asia per se, or is it global in that sense?
So this podcast series is the second series in my podcast channel called Social Justice Chatter Matters. And the first one was Canadian based, so Canadian South Asian scholars across Canada. We did interviews, 8 of them, and that series is complete. And now this is the second series that's focused on scholars in India, primarily to see how they understand social justice issues in the context of India. So we're using both of these series to have a better pulse on how South Asian scholars are understanding social justice in contrast to Canada across multiple disciplines and also in India in multiple disciplines in various post-secondary institutions. Does that help?
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
All right. So with that background in mind, we're going to go into the questions after we ask one more sort of general question of you, if you don't mind. We just to give the listeners a better understanding of who you are, if you wouldn't mind sharing as much or as little about your positionality with our viewers. If you are comfortable sharing where you're from and what you're doing in your professional journey, that would be greatly appreciated before we get into the questions.
okay. So thank you for this opportunity. My name is Suhas Bhasme. So I actually come from a region, in case of India as such, a region called as Marathwada region, which is actually a drought-prone, semi-arid region. So I did my education in this particular region, and this is also important because as per the regional development, we also lack accessibilities, information about education in that particular sense. So coming from this particular region, I actually joined JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, one of the most respectable institute as such, not just in terms of academics, but also building up future leadership in that sense. And from there, I did my MA MPhil. And after finishing my MPhil in political science, I worked as I worked on a research project as part of my PhD at University of Sussex. So I think that's also an important thing because coming from JNU and joining Sussex is almost similar in terms of the vibration that it has, the kind of atmosphere Sussex has. So it was a privilege over there. I did my PhD on water reforms. So primarily, I have been working on water issues in case of India, largely irrigation sector as such, in terms of what kind of reforms have been implemented, what is the positionality of small marginalized farmers when it comes to these particular reforms as such. But apart from that, I have also worked on climate resilient agricultural practices, agriculture transformations that are happening in rural parts of India. So we have done studies across at least the southern belt in that particular sense. We have done it studies in Karnataka, Andhra, Telangana, and now we are currently doing Maharashtra, where we're trying to understand the climate resilient agriculture as such. I think other important aspect of social background in that particular sense, I come from a Dalit Ambedkarite family background. And I think that is not just in terms of identity that matters to me, but also in terms of the ideological positions that also has helped me in terms of strengthening my arguments, in terms of building a much larger, inclusive academic career as such, not just in terms of my own individual, but even as a faculty when I'm teaching at Tata Institute of Social Science, which is again one of the most reputed institutes in terms of education quality, but also in terms of building those kinds of sensibilities among the society. So in that sense, I've been trying to work out in this side. So largely, it's a developmental sector that I'm working.
Thank you so very much. You have such a rich, vast background, and I'm so honored to have you on the show today. And I appreciate you sharing a little bit about your professional journey and about yourself. So, with that background, we're going to move into the questions. The first question, as you've seen in the welcome letter, is how do you understand social justice in your own discipline as a senior faculty member?
So for me, social justice is mostly, as we largely understand it, it is about equal opportunities, equality among the groups, among the individuals as such. But I think it is also one of the most important, essential virtue that we humans organize ourselves in terms of forming of institutions. And I think institutions, the way social institutions play a key role in terms of formulation of our not just providing accessibility to resources, but also formulation of our identities, formulation our well-being as such. In that particular sense, I think social justice is much larger concept for me to understand as such. And in terms of the development sector that I'm talking about, that have worked for a longer period of time, I think social justice concept, particularly in development sector, and that too in development studies as the particularly focusing on water and agriculture's transformation. To my extent, I think yes, social justice is about equality, it is about accessibility per se, but to my extent, it is also been not problematized in the way it should have been. That is what I primarily think, because if you look at most of the development discourses that we have, most of these development discourses does tell you about the way the idea of development in itself is a hegemonic idea, it's a west centered idea, how colonialism underpins this whole developmental project per se. But I think when it comes to social justice, there's not much more discussion on how social justice needs to be unfolded in this whole project of development per se. And I think most of the time we also find that this idea of social justice, even if it is talked in the development sector, say for example in water sector, if it is talked about social justice, then it is merely talked about in terms of accessibility, whether a particular group of marginalized group of people or women get access to the resource or not. And then eventually it is stopped over there. No further discussion is carried, you know, carried in terms of understanding what that really means when you are excluded from accessibility to a particular resource. That problematization has not been really done well when it comes to development sectors, development studies as such. Even in the West, also, if you find most of the time the discourses are about are very much elaborate. I completely understand in terms of post-colonial development, how it has actually shaped, how we need to bring into this local narratives, local knowledges, and participation, the idea of participation itself. But in terms of social justice, what does it really means for those particular groups which have been historically discriminated or marginalized? And that includes probably also the women as such, irrespective of the caste and class position, are to be are to be articulated. I think it's something that still needs to be discussed. The other aspect, just adding to this, I think at least in this current scenario, we cannot really negate the role of corporate in terms of shaping our lives, particularly when it comes to marginalized group, particularly when it comes to um, natural resources as such. And what I also found is that the development discourses, at least not just in the West, but also in case of India, also do not really are not really trying to bring corporate into this particular kind of academic discussions as well. So most of the time, you find the development discourse is merely centered around the issues of state, civil society, and communities. So it is not talking about the other C, that is the corporation as such. And I think that needs to be understood, because social justice is not just now about societies or state in terms of ensuring that they get rights or they get equal opportunities. It is also about this larger corporate world, which is occupying a much larger space in our economic discussions, in our economic activities as such. So I think that is primarily important in terms of my understanding of social justice, the way it has completely elaborated, but way it is still to an extent restricted, I think, in terms of the uh, way it has to be explored in the development sector and particularly water sectors.
I think that's fascinating. So, just so I have this right, you would like to expand your understanding of social justice beyond what is available in academic literature right now, which sort of focuses on equality and accessibility, but doesn't talk about the applications or the implications on those who are affected by the injustice, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
The other piece that you
Uh,
would like to draw attention to is, in particular, when we're talking about the application and the implication on these marginalized groups, it's you've assigned equal weight to women across different castes, and then the caste system, those who are marginalized within the caste. So I think that's quite interesting. I would like to know a little bit more about why you would group women and people who are lower on that caste system together in one big group. The second thing that I noticed that you said was that we need to be very mindful about the capitalistic endeavors of privatization in India and also in other parts of the world and how they impact the discourse of social justice. And I would like to hear a little bit more as to what do you mean in terms of how has corporatization or privatization impacted or sped up the influences of injustices? I think this is a wonderful point that is made. I would love to hear what you think about both of those things, if you don't mind.
yeah. So, just a clarification, not to get into political controversy. So, in terms
Sure.
of lower caste groups and women,
Mm-hmm.
so I think, so definitely I'm not, when I'm saying women, I think generally we need to understand women in that sense, because
Mm-hmm.
uh, to my understanding is what Ambedkar and Phule has also elaborated in their own writings, the way the women themselves are into a prison of the social structures itself. The choices, even the choices they are making, they are not out of their own choices per se, but it is something that this is been born on them by the larger social structure as well. So in that particular sense, definitely I think women needs to be emancipated in sense like needs to develop those critical abilities to look at their own structural inequalities as such, even those sound them to be benefits to an extent, but those benefits are restricting their ability to think critically and to come out of that particular trap. So I think that needs to be taken into care, and that is why I think women needs to be uh, definitely being needs to be included as such when it comes to the larger marginalized group as such. In fact, I would also say this is an interesting example of Ambedkar it's himself, that when he was talking about the Hindu Code Bill and the about the position of women, particularly the widow women as such, and a particular person went to him and that's what do we why do we really need to talk about widows as such when we are ourselves are struggling with so much with resources, and then what do we really have to do with them? And he said that you should definitely go and visit a Hindu widow as such and the kind of life she lives. So if you do not understand the pain that others have, you cannot really stand for your own struggle as such. So I think in that larger sense, definitely I think women should be included as such. But despite this, I also definitely recognize the caste inequalities in terms of women that also manifest. But interestingly, I think even in this particular thing, caste inequalities that manifest here, most of the time you will see that people place lower caste women in comparison to the upper caste women. However, I think actually it is opposite. I think the kind of operation the lower caste woman has gone through, it is necessary for her to be out there in the public sphere and to carry out the everyday tasks, to fight for her rights and everything. And I think that has it really empowered her much more than upper caste woman. So she has a much more freedom of choice in terms of, so we have been, so there is always this tendency of both the liberal academicians and the lead academician, although that you romanticize the operation as such, and in a sense, but I think that is not really true. The women's have sustainably put forward their aims, their voices as such when it comes to lower caste women. I've seen in the rural panchayats that the women are sitting in front of rural panchayat and they're discussing about the access to the common toilets as well. And I think that is something that upper caste women would have never talked in a public sphere. And they rampantly said, "Arey, there is no door to our toilets. What do you expect? You want us to put a full show before all of us?" And I don't think a upper caste woman will be able to do that. So I think in that particular sense, they have been actually much more free. They have much more of their own autonomy compared to an upper caste woman as such. So what we really need to do is to free the upper caste woman and to help her to gain her that autonomy as such. And I'm telling you that education, merely education, higher class does not really mean that she has gained her autonomy as such. Even in the liberal corridors of academics where women has a lot of voice, I'm not sure they really has liberalized or or they have gained an autonomy in that particular sense. At least you could clearly see today also. uh, at least now this Dasara thing is going on in case of India, right? And across liberal, particularly the liberal scholars who comes from Bengal, they will all celebrate, glorify Dasara. And if a Ambedkar Dalit questions, "Arey, but this is again worshipping of God." No, no, it is not needs to be think in that narrow perspective. It has to be broader. This idea is inclusive and everything. But we know religious celebrations have eventually and always been about exclusion. And so how do you can glorify idea of celebration, religious celebration, in a very accommodative way? As so, I think, uh, and they always have their own intellectual debates about it. But I think this is precisely what needs to be understood. That criticality has to be very much strongly there. I'm not against religion per se, but I think you should also understand the larger history of those particular practices and try to question those particular practices. So sometimes I find that even though you have understanding history and everything, but you still continue to follow those practical practices, giving some alternative explanations, but you do not want to distance yourself from those particular practices. I think that is the trap that I'm talking about, and that needs to be critically brought into our discussion.
Okay, so that's also interesting. I know we're going to get to the second question of privatization and corporatization in a second, but just
Yeah.
to quickly respond to this sort of dichotomy that you have created between lower caste women and higher caste women is interesting because, you know, social economic status is often equated very high in terms of wealth and superiority, and using that as a form of discrimination to allow one feel more prominent and more secure in the eyes of society and more accepted and welcomed because of their wealth. But here you are offering a contrary argument about women and their ability to speak when they are from higher castes. And I think that's very interesting that you're holding that. But I'm sure at some point in time, given the fact that these women are respected and they are given this privilege, there is a reason for why they are upholding that privilege and not speaking out. What is the
Mm.
cost to them to not, why are they not choosing to speak out given their respected and social class, which is of utmost importance in India, from what I am gaining from these interviews? If finance really matters and reputation matters, and you're in the elite class as a woman, why is it that the woman is not speaking?
So let me tell you again. So I had worked mostly in rural parts of India as such, and I think when you understand this, uh, you also get. So now there's a women membership is a new thing, right? You need to have women's in every part of every community, every committee you want, panchayat you want, water user association want, every committee you need to have women. And if you are able to make a woman head of your association, then that's a gala thing in terms of development sector. You will be appreciated by bureaucrats, you will be rewarded by the state and everything. And when a woman becomes a president or a head of any of an organization, there are obviously going to be incentives, there are obviously going to be benefits for her. And I think those particular brands, so leave apart those elite, rich elite, but even in a small setup of a village, the limited benefits that she gets in terms of public sphere, in terms of the way people approach her, talk her, that in itself, as you said, that in itself might be incentives for her to not really come out of this particular trap. because at the end of the day, even though she is there, but she has to also recognize she is there because of some support from the male community as well, the males within her community as well. So I think in that particular sense, she'll not necessarily be able to question, even if she has abilities as well. But even within this also, the aspect of age becomes very critical. So if you are young, married, then eventually you will have less possibility of being there in the public space or articulating your voice. You can be heard, but still you will not be able to attend the meetings regularly. Whereas in case of an older woman, widow woman, it is easier for her to occupy that public space, because the kind of shame associated with women's appearance in public space, particularly when it comes to upper caste, that kind of a thing is not there when it differs according to the age per se. So yes, to an extent, I think in a rural setup, you definitely have these limitations as such, but also in the larger academic liberal setup, also you might not necessarily explicitly see them, but these are also very invisibly exist upon them, and they themselves will not necessarily want to give up those particular privileges. I think also it is also about the kind of support they get.
Hmm.
So I think that is much more difficult uh,
This,
to think in
that,
that sense.
okay. I really appreciate your insights on this, and it begs the question of patriarchy in India and how stable and structured it is. And I wonder if this false notion of superiority and authority is given to women in these higher standings, whether it's social class or from being in a leadership position. I wonder if this is almost at the same level of affirmative action policies for those from the lower caste or from the backward caste, communities. And it's strange to me. There seems to be a mirage of authority and a mirage of superiority when it's not true for women. So I wonder if as a woman, if you will recognize and you realize the limitation and you have this false sense of superiority, how does that actually make it comfortable to have those quote unquote benefits when you're actually not doing very much? And then I'm thinking about political leaders who have been female in India, like Indira
Mhm.
Gandhi. And I'm thinking about how she led the nation and how could it be that a female voice is not heard because she was at one point a prime minister.
Yes.
Anyways, I think we can leave that if you want, and we can come back to it. But I would like to hear your thoughts on the privatization and the corporatization and how it has influence and impact in how we understand social justice in the context of water.
Yeah. So I think so my understanding is the way corporate is now playing role in terms of development as such, in case of India as well as globally as such. It is really we cannot negate in that particular sense. And when it comes to corporatization and injustice, we have tons of evidences already, right? Where we could clearly see the way corporatization is actually encroaching upon the common land properties as well. We have seen these struggles in mostly in the forest areas, where communities have been struggling to maintain their access to forest, where the communities have been struggling to maintain their ownership over these particular traditional resources as such. And that is equally applicable in case of most of the other sectors as well. In water sector also we find that thing, but at least in water sector it is not being in that direct sense as such. So there are interesting works that are being going around, but they have not really come across in terms of questioning the corporate involvement in water sector, because the nature of the resource in itself is also complicated to put that kind of a argument. Say, for example, groundwater exploitation is a major issue in case of India, right? So now we are really worried. Even UN had the groundwater been celebrated. So 2021 or 2022 onwards, UN actually recognized that climate change is about water and water is about climate change as such. And in that particular series, they also talked about recently they had celebrated this groundwater, making invisible visible as such. But when it comes to industrial development, we do not really have strong data sets in terms of how the companies are using water resources person. So most of the time, there's an interesting. So I teach this particular courses. So there is this interesting report by Water Institute, which is about parch energy sources, some parch energy. So this particular interesting report is about energy development in case of India, and how particularly most of these energy development sites that we're talking about do not thermal power station as such, do not really talk about where they are getting their water from. So I think those kind of issues are important. And I think most of the time when it comes to groundwater exploitation, everything, it is eventually also been related to the marginalized communities as well. Because eventually in a canal irrigation area or in an area, so first of all, there are a lot of discrimination within the state provided irrigation systems as well, right? So you come from a lower caste, your land is much more away from the main canal area, command area as such, so you do not have accessibility to water, those kind of inequalities there. Then ultimately when you try to have your own resource in terms of groundwater as such, then again there is an inequality of capital that is required for this particular resource. But then now with the competition of groundwater accessibility, the third layer of uh, competition is that not necessarily one bore well will serve your purpose. You will also need to have other bore wells, right? And the kind of groundwater competition, again there is a capital, again there is, you need to have, the larger the land you have, the larger possibility that you will have access to groundwater. So I think these are complications that are going on. And in terms of corporate involvement, that has not been really explored how it is, explore how they are really manifesting on the field. We also have the phenomena of corporate farming that is coming up, right? Of huge tracts of land been brought up, and then they are being established. So eventually, in a drier region where they have been established, eventually you have access to wages. So you become employee of this particular corporate, and you also gain money from them, and then eventually you use that for development of your own land. But what you do not understand, that in this process eventually you will also lose your land. So at that moment, so what I'm doing on my in my field work, realizing the farmers are actually saying that that's good, because they, that gives them an employment, and that money they can use to invest on their land. But what they really do not understand, that this entire corporatization will eventually made suitable for themselves in terms of market price and everything, and eventually they will be out of the market over a period of time, and they will have nothing to do but provide services to this larger sector as well. So that is something that is not really understood in that particular. We, in fact, we ourselves as academician, we never understood the way privatization really worked out. Today we are struggling with private universities and privatization education as such, but we also have never thought that it would have it would come in this particular shape. Right. So in that particular sense, I think there's a lot of awareness that needs to be still carried out. And those injustices, the voices that these people have. So if you look at most of the mining and other kind of sectors, you will find that there's still a lot of things that needs to be done. People get justice, but those kind of justices almost 10, 12 years after that. So your land has been taken up away, or your resources have been restricted, water resources have been restricted as such. So justices do arrive, but the kind of delay that is made, even that is also a larger thing. And you will find this kind of much more in these particular mining areas as such, where people are active, where there are political consciousness, you will see they are making news. But where they are not, you will eventually find they are not making that. They are having their own silent resistance in that particular sense. But this is something that not really talked about.
So you are alluding to the fact that
Sorry,
privatization.
I'm being bit more elaborative in
No,
my
that's
answers.
fantastic. That's okay. No, it's great. It's rich because you're drawing across multiple different examples that all demonstrate the privatization. So it seems like you are articulating this vision of privatization sweeping over the different industries across Canada with warp speed, more faster. It's taking a hold of lands and these industries more than the people who were first involved in developing and carrying out those works in those industries. But what I fail to understand, the last point that you make around 10 to 12 years in the justice system, what I fail to understand is how is it that the Indian legal system that oversees privatization and gives the green light for these things to occur, for these developments, for privatization, for the gain of economic value to take over and to be prioritized over the well-being of each Indian citizen. How is it possible that the justice system that's supposed to serve the people of India has turned its eye away when it comes to the privatization of all of these industries? How is it possible to allow for privatization in India to a point where the people of India are no longer able to be autonomous and leaders and sustaining their own industries, but rather have become employees for big corporations? And those corporations are now taking over the industries and taking the wealth of diversity across multiple industries in India. How is it possible that the legal system is permitting this, given the severe loss financially and culturally, and just from the dearth of diversity across all of the things that India has to offer? How could the justice system allow these things to occur alongside with the government signing off on it?
I think this is a really difficult and bit uneasy question. Let's put it very honestly to you. But to me, it sounds like coming back to this whole idea that social justice is a virtue that we organize ourselves and that leads to formation of institutions and they should be one. To me, I also teach this as part of my courses. So to me, on one side, definitely, so there is a not really in the sense that justice has gone on the board and have been supportive to the privatization per se. But there are essentially also cases where the justice has been delivered in cases of the marginalized population. They definitely had received their share. So the one, if you have seen this so famous documentary, right? Agar Wo Desh Banati, which is a very popular document about how industries are taking over the land, and in those particular documents it's very thing that justice has been done again of for these particular marginalized communities struggling to maintain their say over the land even after 12 years per se. So in that particular sense, definitely I will say that not necessarily it is completely on board with private corporate world as such, but definitely I would also say there are also incidences where do they all they where we do find that this kind of thing do happen. So for say for example, justice was also done in case of this famous case that Nilgiri thing. I'm not remembering the site. The whole idea of that. So that whole idea was very much also very much there in terms of this Avatar movie. So that is something that really an Indian context where they were fought and justice was being done, just relying on that oral traditions that how they have access to this particular lands and their ownership as well. So the justice system does make an exceptional for them in terms of giving their rights to the communities as well. But definitely, I do understand there are other aspects where you find that they are actually in a way have gone to the private world as such, and there are issues that are happening around. But I think the nature of legal system also needs to be understood in that particular sense. It is so a lot of has been written about Upendra Bakshi and Galanter are the scholars who have really, literally talk about the nature of legal system as such, with the way it has evolved. In case of India, the way it has also been occupied by particular groups in terms of its courtyards that we can call around, and the way it is still continue to have that. So we just do not have this family domination in just politics, but even in the justice systems per se in that particular. So in that particular sense, also there needs to be much more diversity that needs to be incorporated even within the justice system as well. So until and unless you have that kind of a diversity, I think we'll still have this kind of issues coming up. So I'm just trailing one of the factors as such. Even if you look at the records in terms of the High Court judges or the Supreme Court judges as such, you will not find a much of a representation from the marginalized communities in that sense. Although I do understand the power of corporate is much more stronger asset, but at least these are the probabilities that we are talking of. That if we
Mhm.
increase the diversity, there might be a probability of having a more sense of accommodative justice in that particular sense, the diversity. The same argument that we
Mm-hmm.
also give in academic world, right? The more
Mm-hmm.
the diversity we will have, we will be able to have people who understand what the others have been through. It's
Right.
not just about developing empathy, but it is sharing that experience, and that sharing and having those particular experiences, you are able to make these pedagogies more acceptable, more receivable on part of those
Mm-hmm.
diverse marginalized communities as such. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
similar kind of a thing is equally applicable to the legal system as well. The more the diversity we will have, the more experiences that we will have, different diversity in terms of experiences also. So in legal system, we just not is about particular breed, but also about a particular class. So I
Right.
think that diversity needs to be there. Politics definitely
Right.
shown that diversity, interestingly, but not
Mm-hmm.
really these institutions per se. And I think that is where I again say that social justice
Mm-hmm.
should be a virtue of formation of institution, and that should guide us. And that's not really reflecting. And I think that
Yeah.
is one of the probable ways we can actually look forward to.
Okay, thank you for those insights. I do think that social justice as a virtue is an interesting concept, but I also do think that people in leadership positions also have a legal and moral and ethical responsibility to look out for the entire community they serve. So whether there is a representation of those diverse backgrounds, yes, it is great to have that, but there should be a superseding responsibility that regardless of who is there, because let's be honest, we're a long ways away to get all the different diversities that are in India to be represented in the legal system, in the political system, in grassroots organizations, in local community leadership levels. I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon. But then this becomes a stagnating argument, I would argue, to having any progress. I mean, we know what the problem is, we understand what we need to know. So why is it that we're not doing anything about it? Because we're not going to change policies overnight and have a whole bunch of different diverse leaders just pop up. Anyhow, I think we'll stop there and we'll move to question
Yeah.
number
No, so
two,
I just wanted to
right?
reply to your earlier comment about Indira Gandhi.
Yeah.
I think Indira Gandhi is an exceptional, and we cannot compare with an exceptional. Exceptional cannot be norm.
Well, they could
And
be if we created a space for that in the mentality of the women in India. If every woman thought
yeah,
that she could be an Indira Gandhi, I think we would change the discourse of the minds of the young women or the widowed women or the women from, the caste or the backward caste or the scheduled tribes. It's about the
no, but
message we send out, right?
yes, but just adding to that, it is also portraying Indira Gandhi as an example is also,
Mm-hmm.
I think, it also comes from a understanding of women herself, because we have also Mayawati, who comes from a very different background with
Okay.
with nothing of that particular kind of thing that Indira Gandhi had. But the way she has portrayed herself and stronger identity as a leader, also even today as such, I think that
Yes.
is much more appreciated, which is not much mostly done. Whenever it comes to women as someone who has stand out of politics, we always have reference of Indira Gandhi as such, without knowing that the kind of back support that she had in terms of family history and everything. Whereas compared to
Yes.
Mayavati, she has an exceptional. And I think that is the point we should have, that inspiration should be drawn from the models.
Of
We should
course,
question those
of
models as
course.
such,
I think we
where
should
we
draw
draw the
inspiration
inspiration.
from that. But I think we should also think about how men who are in very high level political offices and are also in leadership positions, they have used family status and wealth to achieve those places. So when we see women in levels of empowerment, with all due respect, we should see both of those things as viable possibilities, whether it's family status, wealth, or whether it's somebody who's made themselves from nothing and coming forward. I think all those forms need to be accepted, because if you think from a patriarchal lens, we accept that. We applaud the men who are there from family status and hereditary wealth, right? And social capital that they've been garnered and given. But I think this is fabulous. We need to move to question two in the interest of time. We're
No,
having a
no,
wonderful
definitely.
conversation. Thank you so much. So, question number two is, what, if any, are the social justice issues you have encountered in your area of expertise?
Hmm. Social justice issues in my area of expertise. So again, I will come back to this very same idea. So I will share my, so having this touch of anthropology that my supervisors during my PhD has been successfully been able to baptize me into anthropologists. So I will also share the anecdotes that I have of this particular struggle. So one of the struggle, I think, in terms of social justice, in terms of development sector, or in terms of water sector, is that the researcher himself. So I think, and this is not just about development, so but it actually applies to all the disciplines in social sciences as well. That whenever a researcher comes from a lower caste background, he is actually caught into his own issues per se. So he, even if he wants to make that particular move, he's not able to make that particular move as such. So I think sometimes I think social science is much more dominating and much more entrapped compared to sciences. At least in sciences, you can do genetic science and you can, and nobody will question your identity in that particular sense. You do IT, but here, no matter what discipline you do, history you do, everything. But what about Dalits rights? But why it is necessary that a historian coming from marginalized community will always talk about Dalit history and Dalit rights? As so, he can actually talk about our Mughal history. He can talk about the way technology has evolved historically in our society as such. But these are not something that has been there. And I think academic in itself forces you to do that. And even if you, and that is one. But the other aspect is that when you are on the field, the way inequalities exist in the societies as well, that also restricts your access. So even if you want to get around upper caste farmers and try to understand their life as such, the first question, at least, and I'm saying this from a very coming from a very progressive state like Maharashtra. I cannot imagine what is happening in other states as well, where there is a much more caste domination as well. We had a much liberal political movement for caste rights and everything. And even in those particular setups, you will find the first question they will ask, so what's your surname? And second, what's your caste? If they cannot really get through your surname, then they will directly put up your caste. And the moment you do that, their expressions definitely change for a moment as such, and that gives them an idea what needs to be shared and what not needs to be shared at all. So anthropology actually is an interesting instrument. It has been criticized in terms of a colonial instrument and everything, but I myself find it an interesting because you develop a long-term relationship with the people, and it is only through your long-term relationships you understand what people have been through or what they are struggling with. And I think that particular scope is very limited when it comes to upper caste, until and unless you really have someone who steps aside. And this also steps aside happens because he has someone in his close circle coming from that particular community. And he understands that. And that not necessarily every our friendships even today are very caste bounded in that particular sense. We might have colleagues, but when it comes to sharing of your emotional well-being, you eventually fall back to your own groups. So in that particular sense, that has been a major challenge, I think, in front. So as a social science, we talk about liberating societies, and a liberating society eventually will liberate the academia, but the very source, academia in itself, is trapped in those inequalities as such. And I think that is interesting. That is a struggle, because then you are not really able. So even if you have understanding sensibilities, you so one of the study also that my one of my friend was wanted to conduct on marriages and everything. So he even though he is a very strong Ambedkarite, he did not want to appoint a particular lower caste person, because then you are asking very intimate question to your responders, which is not necessarily going to be lower caste. And how is it that you are going to share? So the caste complexity is so strong that even if he is a stranger, and if that stranger comes from your community, you still do not feel insecure in sharing that information. Imagine sharing information to strangers should make you insecure, but that insecurity also has different levels. So I think that's really still keeping me um, away from exploring these particular territories. And the other experiences also, since in development sectors you also have a lot of domination of other liberal progressive scholars as well. In that particular sense, also the networks that are built. So in development sector, it is not just education per se, but also the field. And you also need to have connections with the field, with the people as such. And the networks that are developed on the fields are obviously developed by some progressive upper class um, academician or a worker who has been there. And even in those particular spaces, you really need to struggle to make your identity, to make yourself acceptable to them. So they might talk to you, but when it comes to a discussion or delivering some messages to the farmers or a talk per se, they will not call you, they will not invite you, despite the fact they've been knowing your expertise, they've been knowing you have been working in this particular areas as well. And I had very strange experiences of this, that someone has been called without being having expertise, but through these particular networks. So I think the bonds that we really have are so strong. So I do not want to buy this idea that caste is definitely that strong. I personally do not. But these experiences just push you back to that same thing. So I remember the one article where she is interviewing. It's by Juliet, I think, where she's talking with the academician. This is an article 20 years ago, and she is asking, "What do you think about it?" And he says that, "I don't think it will go away for 400, 500 years. But after 20 years, me sitting as an academician in one of the most reputed, powerful institutions and everything, I still think it will not go 1,000 years." So that is the thing. It is not that the timeline has will collapse. It will not go 1,000 years at least. There's a lot transformation that needs to be made.
Right.
This might sound very pessimistic, but sorry for that.
No, that's okay. I think it very much leads to our, it connects nicely to our former discussion on the legal system and those in political authority and power. I think you're pointing out very key points. I think this is structural level inequity that's, based in academia was the first one. And the second one, you are talking about the caste system having a structural level of inequity embedded across culture and behavior and interactions amongst people in India. And I think that both of those, if they need to be addressed, they need to come not only from the people, but through the people in the leadership positions in those systems that we spoke about, right? And I think when I think about what happens in Canada when people do discriminatory things, our human rights code, our charter of human rights and freedoms is so strong, and our Supreme Courts uphold them over anybody else's personal desires. So I think it's got to do with the political structures, whether it's the justice system, whether it's the education system, whether it's leaders at the regional level, whether it's police officers. It's the level of accountability of policies and laws and things that are sanctioned that need follow through. Because, as an anthropologist and, someone who is maybe even familiar with sociology, it takes the whole bunch of people, the complexity of the society in multiple structures, in multiple ways to transform a society. And of course, it won't change for 1,000 years if those things are not in place. So I fully hear what you're saying in terms of the structural inequities that are fully intact in academia and also in the larger society when it comes to the caste system. But I think the only way to start thinking of them to unravel and be reconstructed in a way that they're upheld will require leadership from structural organizations and from within the region and within society and at the grassroots level as well. I think that's why it's so important to talk about the justice system and police officers and talk about education, because those are the channels through which we, embed values in people or virtues, as you had mentioned. How else do we teach the virtue of social justice and develop a notion of justice for people if we don't use the structures within our society? And if we can't count on those structures, we have a bigger problem. We are allowing those structures to maintain and sustain the very systems of power that disempower the majority of people in India, right?
That's absolutely true. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where, at least I think I'm working on it in terms of pedagogy. We also need to have develop
Yes,
pedagogies
yes.
that addresses these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And currently, when it comes to India, I'm not really sure whether those pedagogies really exist as such. So one of the things that I do in my classes
Yeah.
is when I teach this much larger classes in terms of school commons. And since the kind of courses that we have here, Center for Water Policy and Governance, School of Habitat Studies, we get
Mm-hmm.
interdisciplinary students. We have engineers, we have doctors, we have social science students, we have
Lovely.
natural sciences students, everything. So what I make sure that any intelligent question put forward by this so-called student coming from a social class with those particular jargons, I make sure that he actually makes it so simple that even the person who comes from a very different background, social background as well as educational background, is understood. It is only when he understood and asked him, "Do you understand the question?" Then only I will try to answer it.
Yeah.
But I think those exercises should be done. I have not experienced those exercises when I was taking my education. Put it very straightforward. When I was in JNU, nobody really took those kind of efforts. The only suggestions that this larger institution has is remedial classes, which is
Okay.
again you are identifying students as weak students that requires the remedial classes. So if someone who's asked, remedial classes also required for those who are considered to be powerful, good students, because they lack the social sensitivity. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have remedial classes for developing social sensitivity among the students. We have
Right.
remedial classes to develop language abilities among the students,
Okay.
which is elementary. Now we know language is not that important because it's just a means to
Yeah.
communicate. It is powerful, but it is just a means. What you need to have is that kind of a sensitivity. But we don't have remedial classes for that. And I think
Right.
that is precisely that is something that I never seen in JNU as well, making those kind of efforts that I do, some of my other colleagues also try to do.
Right. Right.
So
I think,
the
well, that's
pedagogy is never
fantastic
questioned.
that you're
Yeah.
doing that, which is in question three, which is what are some social justice initiatives that are occurring in your discipline to help build awareness and or address social justice issues. So a way that you're dealing with the gap between potentially different diverse students and who come from different diverse communities is you're adopting a pedagogy to ensure that knowledge mobilization is one that is not only accessible but understood and can be implemented by all of your students, and you're not recreating the same power differences between those diverse groups of students, right? To some
Yes.
extent, if you think about it, your critique on remedial classes is exactly once again looking at how do we maintain the social structures to make sure there's a difference between different diverse communities. So something is when language is used in a way to be exclusionary and extremely heavily academic, it's used as a form of exclusionary practice. You are trying to maintain power when you do that in your class. So you're recreating a discriminatory process to limit knowledge from those very people you don't want have don't want them
Yes.
to have access. So this in Canada we call epistemic injustice. So you're trying to create knowledges, theories of knowledge that exclude people, that are not something that somebody else, other knowledge forms and lived experiences are not valued or seen as worthy or praiseworthy. You exclude people through it because you think there's only one way of a theory of knowledge that should be mobilized in the university space. So it's wonderful to hear that you are making inroads with this with your colleagues. Is there anything else that you think you have been able to try out to sort of address some of these structural level inequities that you have seen and so well articulated, by the way?
Yeah. So I'm currently also, so there's a lot of thing that has been also done in terms of Dalit NGOs, right? So we have David Moss, who is working on this entire Dalit NGOs. He has a larger project. He has also published a paper and how kind of uh, things they are going through. But I still think that, and I'm trying myself also to work with some of these local NGOs as well, and trying to build up in a way that they actually talk about the larger issues as such. So this might actually sound very annoying in a sense that Dalit NGOs working not really want to talk about Dalit rights as such, but actually at least in the terms of the language, they should have those elaborative languages as such. And development sector is all about language. Let's be very honest. How you frame your proposal, How you frame your funding application, everything that has to be there. And I am trying to do that with the local NGOs per se, in terms of developing those instruments for them to access the larger funds as such, so that they become more elaborative, they become more diverse in that particular sense, and they become more accommodative also. So that is one of the aspect that I'm trying to do with the local NGOs as such. Not many, there are just one or two that I'm working on, and I'm still want to get more involved, because I think that is how we are going to make meaning to our reality. The merely publications are definitely good. I'm already doing that. That's fine, but there should be some gradual change. We cannot just question all the time and leave things for the others to do, but some smaller efforts that we should do. So that is one thing I'm doing. I'm also trying to build up, and I'm also part of different organizations that are working in terms of developing educations, the way different opportunities are available for the students as such. So I'm also working on that, helping out the students to develop those languages, those requirements that are required as such, and that is how. So we also need to do that. So we also need to work on the field. We also make access to this larger academic world, because despite we can break this only when you have people at both sides, in the academic world, who are actually going to frame it, and on the field, who are actually going to raise it. So if you do not build this, so I'm not really sure. So there is always this say that, array, that academic thing is not going to change our reality and everything. And that is very much strong in the movements as well. When it comes to marginalized community, because that is true also. The reality has not changed a lot for them. But now I've been in this particular position, I do understand that how do you frame a particular problem, how do you implement it, how do you make access to it, that also matters a lot. So I think that kind of a work with my other colleagues, I'm also trying to do that. So that's very,
Mhm.
very minimal that I'm doing at this particular
I
moment.
wouldn't call it minimal. You're being very modest. I think it's exactly that, because remember how we talked about we need to have, in order for make a to make a larger societal transformation, you need the grassroots organizations and their leaders and their members to be on board. And you have the political leaders, and you have the justice people, and you have the education people, all, and the industry leaders all working together, right? It's the complement of a variety of leaders and a variety of stakeholders in order to do this work. So it's wonderful to see that you're supporting your students and you're out in the field, you're working with NGOs in the community, and that, you've taken this on. I just, you're supporting all of these people who are in more vulnerable positions. But is there a way to challenge those colleagues who hold deficit attitudes towards these very things? So those who are sending these very diverse students off to remedial classes, how are they breaking their model of thinking that is deficit based? Or how are we challenging those who do come from upper castes and hold very elite positions and are men? How do we get them to think differently? Because we're putting a lot of work and effort in our marginalized communities and asking them to rise up. But what about those at the top who are kind of fixed in their thinking? I like the smile. Thank you.
So Manu, let's be honest with that. I'm also part of the power structure, and we all are in that particular sense. And it actually becomes very difficult when it comes to your own colleagues, and particularly in social sciences, because it's it's like in social sciences, if you are part of social sciences, it is assumed that you are sensible. That assumption, it's so strong. And then I think also you are also able to pretend yourself, and it becomes difficult to unmask you or even to understand the other. It is only, again, I'm saying this anthropological idea of being with the respondent. That is only when you be with them, you actually try to understand what kinds of fears the others have, what kind of insecurities the other have. And it is not necessarily in one interview, you will never be able to understand what people will have. People will have liberal ideas, everything. But it's only through these intimate relations that you have with the people, it is in those particular moments they show up. And that is what I'm saying, that internally in the consciousness, it is so deep. So I thankfully to this social reformist movement and education section that we have been able to bury them so deep. They were lying up, but now with this, they have been pushed down, pushed down, pushed down. They have been buried much deeper. But in situations of insecurities and fear, at least in Indian society, I think that is what comes first, to regain your caste superiority or something. And I think
Okay.
that is a struggle that we consistently do. I think we will have to do. We will have to have those dialogues. Also, making sure that you are not really annoying them,
Right.
because I don't think being in isolation is really going to help in terms of building
Mm-hmm.
those dialogues or building. You are actually losing those opportunities also if you are getting away. But that is also I also prefer not to do it at a compromise of at a larger compromise, that you're completely giving up your idea, because then eventually you are also getting to, so it is a very delicate thing. You will always have to be conscious.
Yeah.
And I think that is the major burden that the marginalized community people have, that it is
Yeah.
on their part. They have to be conscious 24 into 7. The price, they should be the ones who should not be, but they are the ones who had to be. So you cannot
Mm-hmm.
really have those happy sleeps. You should always be conscious all the time.
Yeah, so in Canada we have similar, like there's a lot of pushback. So we talk about the resilience of marginalized communities and we think about the Indigenous peoples here and how they need to be resilient. But they have pushed back and said it's not our job to educate you. It's not our job to teach you how not to be harmful to us. It's your job to do your homework and it's your job to understand what you have done. And it's your job to undo the implications that you have so severely put into our lives. And for us to regain our freedoms and our authority and a rightful place. So it's quite interesting to hear the flipped script, and when you talk about, it might be a really good thing that it's so deep in the consciousness of these people who are very privileged in society in India to have these deficit attitudes, and they only come out in these little moments. I wonder if that's actually more dangerous because it's so hidden and it's not out there, right? People are not going to show their intentionality as robustly. So in Canada, we have, as in question 4, more about microaggressions. So discrimination is now done passively, and the intentionality is not clear, and it's so vague. But the pain of going through those experiences is just as strong, if not stronger. However, it's now done in such a covert way and subtle way that it's very difficult to pinpoint. So in my opinion, it seems to be more dangerous when people have in-depth internalized a deficit attitude instead of been forthright about it. But so we'll move with that thinking into question 4. It's more personal, so please,
Just an example is,
yeah,
since I'm working in the sector, it
yeah.
was easier when people were discriminated at the source in terms of well or lake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But when we had actually introduced pipe systems, it
Yep.
becomes difficult, because
Yeah.
then the discrimination is can be done easily, but it is
Mm-hmm.
very hard to identify. So I think that is
Exactly.
how we have gone through the pipes now. This
Yeah. Yeah, so you could take that same example and now map it onto how the caste system and how people discriminate based on caste status and gender, which is so well deep within their psyche that now you can't pinpoint the intentionality. It becomes a real issue, right? It's like a parallel if you think about it. Anyhow, so question number 4 is a little bit more personal, and I'm conscientious of the time, so I'm going to move to 4 if that's okay. Um,
I thought we already reached to 6 questions. Sorry for that.
no, no, no. We're on number 4. So, how do you respond to microaggressions or forms of discrimination, if any, that you have personally experienced? So, feel free to share what you're comfortable with.
Fine. No, no, that's fine. So I think just not me, but most of us also. So we have our peer groups. So that is why I was telling about these friendships and peer groups, right? So the peer groups that you have, the friends that you have, and friends in the sense like you have friends for much longer period of time, those who have seen you through your ups and downs of your life, and those who also understand you, the kind of situations you have been, those are. So I have my own circle in terms of my academic section, academic world as well, and I think I fall back on them if I had this kind of issue as such. So they not just provide me emotional support, but they also give me solutions to address this thing. But I think again, one might say then that that is precisely we are not breaking caste, right? But I think that is a different thing that is what the interesting complexity that we have. So when we say that caste friendships are bad, and now I'm talking about caste friendship as a supportive group, then eventually I'm maintaining. But I think that that is a different way we need to understand, because the experiences that you have is very hard and this is personal. I've been abroad, I have friends across globe and everything, but I still think that experiences the marginalized communities have is very hard for someone who has never had that. He might have empathy, he or she might have empathy, but to understand that is very difficult. I will definitely say I will never be able to understand a transgender experiences. Both of us will never be able to understand, right, in that particular sense. And I accept that limitation. Similarly, I think that is also comes to the marginalized group experiences. And in that particular sense, I still fall. There are been exceptional friends of mine who has been able to move away from this caste distinction, and they have bonds, and I feel no hesitation in sharing even my personal things with them. But that is a very different phenomena. They will continue to be identifying themselves with the ideology which is not really of that they are representing with me, and they are understanding me. But that is a bond of human, that is the beauty of human relationship. So in my case, I definitely fall on those particular friend circles, friend groups that I have when it comes to these particular issues. And obviously you always have this meta narrative of Ambedkar always in support of you. If he has gone through, then who are we? So we will have to sustain ourselves. That's precisely my short question, considering the short reply, considering we already exceeded the time. Sorry for this.
No, no, that's okay. So you've kind of answered number 5 in this question
Yeah.
as well. You've talked about the inspiration and support when dealing with discrimination on a structural and a policy level in your field. So yeah, I think your point is well taken. Lived experience of marginalized communities cannot be replaced. It is something that is an authentic experience that occurs and is felt over many years, over many instances, over many iterations. And I think that holds a special part in how we understand and face structural level inequities. So I really do appreciate your point there. So let's move to question 6, which is the one about what are some possibilities or recommendations that you have to help promote social justice education in your discipline. So now that we've had this lovely conversation, what do you think?
I think, first of all, as I always been, and this is precisely the larger argument also when it comes to socialism, representation is one of the things that we need to take into account, that there needs to be diversity, that needs to be taken account, that diversity needs to be accommodated. But as we do that, diversity is also has become an essential norm for getting your funding, not just in terms of the proposal, but also in terms of institutions, their ranking and everything. That should not be a tick box activity. That is what I think. It should be something that institutions really want to build. And if they are going for this diversity, they should also ensure that once you have this kind of a diversity, there is also that environment that is conducive to this diversity. That environment also accommodate you to this diversity. And I'm talking both diversity in terms of the teaching positions, academic structures as such, but also in terms of the students as. It is only when you have that kind of accommodative environment, only then we'll be able to address these kinds of issues as such. And in that particular sense, I again will say we should have remedial classes for social sensitivity among the academic position people, like administrative, non-administrative, teaching, everyone. I think that that is much more important in that particular sense, because it is difficult to say that, अरे बेटा वो तो means he is an upper caste, वो तो he will attend tick box sitting. I'm definitely sure he or she will do that, but there will be at least one or two people who will think differently. One or two people who will be able to hit, will be able to strike them. And I think that's how we believe social reforms and social movements takes place. It is step by step over a much longer period of time. But we should have these kinds of issues, and there should not be assumptions that needs to be taken. That since he comes or she comes from this, he or she understood it. I'm not sure. There are people, friends of mine, who has saying that because we had this larger group, we were able to understand some of the issues. I think that is something that needs to be built up. So accommodating diversity, but also creating those environments for accommodating that diversity as such.
So your main recommendations is to ensure that there's diversity within the student population and also within the faculty. And more importantly, is actually making it something, a conducive environment that accommodates space for their thoughts, to give them decision-making power, and actually
Yes.
a mobilization of action and practice, not just a seat, right? In
Yes.
terms of saying that you've met the affirmative action policy. And then the other piece that you've mentioned now twice in this podcast session is this idea of social sensitivity remedial classes. And this is a very interesting piece because here in Canada, there is a lot of discussion around social justice education and how that is embedded even on an elementary and high school level, which is compulsory. So another area that, we think about in Canada is how do we embed what you call a virtue of social justice, we call a value of social justice into our public school education, which is compulsory for all, regardless of who gets a seat and who does not get a seat. Everyone who attends any type of government school or private school or middle, like a medium school, all of those schools in India would be required to learn about social justice from the very young ages of entering into compulsory schooling. What do you think about that idea?
I think that's really important as well to do that. But I think that also is very difficult
Mm-hmm.
whether it will be able to achieve that kind of significance. Because I tell you my own experience in our school days, we had this civic as a subject where you actually talk about rights of citizenship and everything. And
Right.
you also have a subject of moral science,
Of course. Mm-hmm.
right? But you don't have any careers in this, right?
No. I see. So I see what you're saying, that maybe this training or this thinking doesn't lead to an economic output or a career trajectory. Is that
No,
is
no.
that what you're
So
alluding to?
no, 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 no. I'm saying that you don't have economic uh, benefit of this, right?
Yes,
So in
yeah, you
that
don't.
particular, and then even when you are not really making that subjects as a essential in that particular sense, they're
Mm-hmm.
always there because you need to have them.
Mm-hmm.
So we had this moral science, which was very important. As today, I
Right.
think that subject
Yes.
was the most important. It should have been taught by a teacher who actually has gone through everything. A much
Right.
more experienced teacher should have taught it,
Right.
but it is not. It was not never taught by an experienced teacher. It was something that we have to do. So we have been allotted this one particular period. That's it. You do it. You
Mm-hmm.
have this particular subject and you do away with it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think we also need to. So I am saying that this is also based on the very norm of participation, right?
Okay.
Participation has become of technology now. It was an act of social. It was an idea of social transformation, but
Right.
now it has assumed a form of a technology where you assemble people together in a
Mm-hmm.
particular formation and you roll the
Mm-hmm.
engine.
Mm-hmm. So I think this
So
brings
that
me
is also a
to,
danger that involves. That is what I'm just pointing out. It is a good
yeah,
initiative. I definitely think it should be done. It should be done in most of these IITs which are giving us just intellectual giants, technological giants, and it should be helping in that particular sense. But there is this also the catch that is involved in this
yes,
particular
but
argument.
so I wonder, so if I think alongside you, like if this was only done in post-secondary, it's going to have a limited level of influence because those who are going to post-secondary institutions and are in those spaces are a very few fraction of the major population of India. And if we think about the structures that hold compulsory education in place in India, this is another, I wouldn't want to call it an industry, but it's another really prominent structure in any society, in any country, any nation that holds a great deal of force and a great deal of influence and possibility and hope for transformation in a society. So if we're having difficulties in finding qualified teachers and finding
Mm,
rich teachers, perhaps we need to turn our eye to what we ask when we make teachers licensed to become teachers. So we need to look
mm,
at our teacher education programs. We need to think about the value we assign to our teachers. We need to think about the money we put into the education system. We need to think about education in a way where it's not technical. It's not only about economic gain, but it is about having high quality education for all children from everywhere and a
yes.
commitment made by the nation to having those qualified, experienced teachers who need to be with their students in the room to teach these very issues if they do want to create some level of a change. So perhaps it's
Yes.
not a question of underqualified teachers, but it's a question of how, again, when it comes to regulations and policies and stamping licenses for those people who become teachers, we need
Mm,
to look at those policies. We need to look at the people who are approving these policies and why are they doing that?
yes.
If really we believe in education as a possibility for the future, right? So I
Yes.
think that's the
That's
same thing
that's
in
correct.
post-secondary, right? Again, which people are we employing? How are they trained? How are they facilitated in these conversations? And how will we use that as not turning on the engine, but creating enough empowerment in our students, whether they're elementary, middle school, high school, post-secondary students, that they have the momentum and the confidence to go and
Yes.
change things and lead things and believe and not feel insecure with respect to their own identity. I don't
That's
know.
true.
That's an interesting, I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah,
No?
definitely. I think it is not also about. So this is also, so I'm just taking few minutes and I'll just say. So
Sure, sure.
largely in terms of Ambedkarite discourse also, it is not really about in a sense of not transforming the consciousness, but also having your rights, having your say. That is much more important. But at this particular point, I realize that that is important. You have your rights, you have your space and everything. But at a particular point, the other has to be involved in. You cannot have human society. And that's precisely why Ambedkar really went for Buddhism. Because there will be right discourses and everything, but you also need to have that moral sentiment. Matlab, how are we going to? We will be. So there are historically there have been communities who have come from under marginalized communities, and they have restored their economic wealth and economic prosperity. They established themselves, but the structure remains more or less like that only. They have got mobilized themselves. There's a social economic mobility, but the remaining structure is like that. So I think as an Ambedkarite scholars, I think as an Ambedkarite, we have to think much beyond that. We should think that people should come out of their experience. They should not be insecure of sharing the personal experience without knowing the cause. That is how we should be able to build our society. And it's difficult. Let's be honest.
It is difficult, but like you said, those things that we see as exceptions can be normalized if that's the message we want to send, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
we need to push people to normalize being exceptional. We need to push people to normalize talking about who they are. And we need to move from a discourse from asking for rights to being able to work together in partnerships and collaborations to move everyone forward. And I
Yes.
think that happens through education on all stages.
Yes,
But
definitely.
perhaps I've said too much. Anyhow,
No, no,
thank you
no.
so very, very
We have
much.
only the hope we have is of education. That's all
Yeah.
it is.
Well, it's definitely one of the hopes, right? We'll have to, well, that whole privatization, corporatization, that other piece we really do need to think about too, right? We
Yeah,
can't,
definitely.
it's got to come from all different angles. But thank you so very much for your insights. How lovely it is to talk with you and have these wonderful conversations. They are very inspiring, and it's wonderful to know that you're doing this great work at Tata University. I'm very, very pleased to hear there's such brilliance and aspirations that are being created within your institution by you. They're lucky to have you. So thank you.
No, no, there are many, many colleagues like who are working, putting those efforts, but I'm really thankful to you and sorry to keep you awake. It's almost half past 12, I
That's
guess.
okay.
So that's thing. But thank you. And I enjoyed this as an opportunity because it also gave me a time to think about this, some of these
Mhm.
important issues as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.